Hi, everybody. Today's Tuesday, August 19th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Let's start, John, with the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska. How did you find the meeting, and what were the main points? We haven't heard anything about the proposal. What was the proposal on the part of the United States? That the Russian part said that they were fine with the proposal. What has happened during the meeting? Ha- what were the main points, in your opinion, to be considered?
Well, we have moved on quite a ways since that meeting, obviously, and we have to understand now what was agreed then in the light of what's happened since the meeting with Zelensky and then the European leaders in the White House on Monday. It's time for me to ask that all the young people leave the room, and anyone with a weak stomach whose gag reflex is the slightest bit weak should leave the room while we discuss what's happening. What's happening on the in general is one of the most cynical, corrupt shakedowns the world has ever seen. What we now know from Monday's events, and then we'll go back to your question about what President Putin agreed and is about to have to deal with, is not demilitarization, not the end of the war, but rather the remilitarization of the Ukrainian army, funded by the Europeans, paid to the United States, in combination, $100 billion program of remilitarizing the Ukraine behind a series of what are now called security guarantees. That's the fig leaf. Remilitarization is the program now. What happened in Alaska had already been agreed for discussion and understanding on the part of President Putin and President Trump. And I think we've said it before. What happened had been pre-programmed, in part at the meeting between Mr. Vitkov and President Putin in the Kremlin several days earlier, in part in the communications that Foreign Minister Lavrov has had with Secretary of State Rubio over the past four weeks. The American side was slow, much slower than the Russian side, in spelling out the program, the official itinerary. And so what we now know from the leaks that occurred subsequent on the American side, subsequent to the meetings, and from the difference between the reality of the meetings, the American schedule and the Russian schedule, what was originally intended announced by Yuri Ushakov, President Putin's assistant on foreign affairs, was a one-on-one meeting to be followed by an extended delegation meeting that would then have lunch, that would then followed by a press conference. That was what Ushakov posted on the Kremlin. Just as well he did it, because at no point did the White House release a schedule. Instead, what leaked through National Public Radio and a couple of other sources was a set of papers which had been left behind in a printer by a State Department official in too great haste, forgetting that the program had been printed and then forgot to take the original out of the tray. It's a common mistake. But what it reveals is the following. In the first place, the US side didn't trust Trump to meet with Putin alone. What was originally to be a one-on-one with consecutive interpreters, just interpreters without electronics, without recording, just note taking plus consecutive interpreting. That was to have lasted not less than 40 minutes, not a great deal of time, followed by the extended delegations. What then happened, according to the State Department program, was a 3-on-3. And that was to have lasted a relatively short period of time. That's Rubio, Vitkov, and Trump on the one hand, and on the Russian side, President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and not Vitkov's money oligarch business counterpart, Kirill Dmitriev, but rather Yuri Ushakov. Dmitriev was entirely isolated from the Alaska meetings. The discussion of money, bribes, business, for which Dmitriev and Vitkov are the counterparty negotiators, was isolated from the central talks. But there was no extended delegation. The press conference, according to the State Department protocol, was to have lasted an hour. It lasted 12 minutes, 8 of which was taken up by President Putin reading a pre-prepared script. So it's very important we understand that from a Russian point of view, what was essential to determine was for President Putin, does Mr. Trump understand what the Russian positions are, the central Russian positions? After all, he said as many times he needed to see and meet with President Putin to understand what the parameters are. He repeated what the parameters are, as if there'd been no negotiation since February when they first had their first telephone call. It's as if, and this is clear, President Trump does not read the term sheets. He does not understand the terms. He, however, has 1 or 2 slogans fixed, idée fixe, in his head. On the way in, he had an idée fixe. There must be a ceasefire. And I'll be very disappointed, he said as he flew into Alaska, if there isn't. On the way out, he had given up the notion of a ceasefire. And what subsequently he agreed to do was that there would be a negotiation of a peace agreement, of which a ceasefire would be a consequence and a part, but a result of coming to agreement on a range of terms for peace. This then becomes the new idée fixe in President Trump's head on his way out. Peace agreement, no longer ceasefire. So from a Russian point of view, it was essential for President Putin to address Trump directly, not on the telephone, face to face, in a context in which he could judge, did the American president understand what the Russians' positions are? If so, then President Putin was prepared to make a range of compromises around the central objectives. Now, we'll come back to the central objectives because they've taken a new form over the last day or two. On the way there, and the reason I invite children to leave the room and have the elderly listeners check their gag reflex, is that Melania Trump issued a letter about the children that was passed to President Putin. It was then rehashed yesterday on the part of Zelensky, who presented President Trump with a reply to this letter. This is cynical, corrupt, and disgusting politics. Why? Because it was paid for. This was a stunt, repeating the Ukrainian propaganda line about missing children, a complete fake that the Russian side has failed, despite months of effort, to show to be fake. Why did Mrs. Trump issue such a letter? Well, she didn't initially draft it. It combines two telltale signs of cynical corruption. One is Israeli, the other is Ukrainian, and they combine in the person of Zelensky. After all, if you care about children and you care about the United States commitment to the survival of children, Mrs. Trump might have referred to the US contributions to the genocide of Gazan children, Palestinian children, for the last months. The cynicism of this as a diversion from the Israeli genocide is too obvious, and there's only one way that gets done at the White House level. It gets bought, paid for. That's what that is. And that's a sign of the level of corruption, cynical propaganda manipulation that preceded the round of meetings as Zelensky arrives in Washington, plus the European leaders. Then the cynicism and the corruption get significantly bigger in scale. Why do I say that? Because on the one hand, there is only one figure at the table, the mini chancellor of Germany, the man whose political mandate has slipped below 24% now. That's how unpopular Merz is in Germany, is the only one to say publicly that there must be a ceasefire first. All the others, including Zelensky, have hinted that with the appropriate security guarantees around the map for a proportional redistribution of territories, there may be a peace agreement. But the conditionality attached to that is no longer ceasefire. It's President Putin must come and meet Mr. Zelensky. And with or without President Trump in attendance immediately, but certainly a troika for purposes of organization and for holding hands at press time. Now, that's the new conditionality, and the Europeans have verbally said they're not sure that President Putin will have the courage to show up. But what's on the table now? What's on the table now reverses the understandings President Putin thought Mr. Trump had, correcting the idea of no ceasefire, we will have a peace agreement. A peace agreement from a Russian point of view means, first of all, an end to war. Second, it means no resupply of the Ukrainian military forces from NATO and US stocks. Third, it means a halt to the intelligence sharing that makes it possible for the Ukrainians to go on attacking Russia. Mostly US satellite, fixed wing and drone satellite, drone intelligence gathering. Those three elements would be part of a peace agreement. But a peace agreement also means there's no more, martial law is no longer sustainable in the Ukraine. Without martial law, the illegitimacy of a president ruling without elections has to be corrected. There must be elections. Therefore, there must be a regime change. Whether or not Zelensky would be re-elected is another matter. Frankly, we have to admit Zelensky has the best chance of being re-elected because the alternatives, General Zaluzhny, ex-President Poroshenko, and others, have much less public support and represent no significant change in line. So, peace agreement carries all those political and military elements. Call them the fundamental objectives of the Russian special military operation: demilitarization and denazification. As to territory, this is not discussed in Alaska. It was, however, discussed in Washington yesterday. But what is new, and our audience must control the gag reflex because it's so cynical and so corrupt, is an attempt to revive and rewire the war so that the Ukrainian military plus the Germans will be in a position to fight again in 2, 3, or 4 years. It's kicking the can down the road, but down the road just long enough for Merz, Maloney, Starmer, Macron, even Stubb will no longer be in power. So it's their retirement, a very, very lucrative form of retirement on a constituency that can't persuade the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, or anyone else in Europe to pay for it. And yet this table of weaklings, all of them with public approval below 25%, Maloney included, are jamming down the Russian, position now to a series of security guarantees with no demilitarized zone, only a remilitarization of the Ukraine to fight again. That's what's happening. And so a very serious question arises. The reason I begin with the Melania Trump cynically corrupt letter is that this new remilitarization is also cynical and corrupt. The $50 billion worth of US arms to be financed through the Ukraine and purchased from the United States. Second, $50 billion commitment to investment by the United States in the construction of long-range attack weapons in the Ukraine itself. Yes, long-range drones, but a new form of long-range attack against Russia, absolutely denying the possibility of a demilitarized zone and the protection of the new Novorossiya, the new Russian territories, or of the hinterland. So what's been achieved? Well, we'll go on discussing that. But the contrast between today, Tuesday morning, US time, and Friday afternoon in Alaska time is extraordinary. And for our audience to understand the number of cynical, corrupt, political, and military surprises coming is one thing. We mustn't be any doubt about that. The question is, when and how will the Russian side, and principally President Putin, call the situation for what it really is?
John, do you feel it seems that yesterday during the talk between Europeans together with Zelensky and Donald Trump suddenly has decided to talk with Vladimir Putin. He called Putin. That was
Yes.
right, in your opinion? What was the issue, in your opinion, if that was the case?
Well, there's no doubt that there was the call. There was, and it's been acknowledged on the Kremlin side, I believe it was a 40-minute call. Presumably now President Putin and President Trump speak in English. What we know from an unguarded microphone during yesterday's meetings, which has been picked up in the Russian press today, but I notice the incompetent American press didn't hear the open microphone. Didn't hear the open microphone, which has been heard all over Moscow. Okay, nothing new there. What was heard was that Trump says to Macron, you know, as wild as it might sound, Putin really wants to give me a deal. Now, that let's take everything with a pinch of political salt here and take account of Trump's monumental incapacity to understand or even hear what other people are saying. He told Macron he thinks Putin wants to appease, ingratiate, and give Trump a deal. Okay? That's what Trump thinks. Right. So the answer to your question really goes to the problem of how can Putin respond on the telephone when Trump is trying to show that he's doing everything possible to make it possible for Putin to give Trump the deal he wants. That's the nature of this telephone exchange business. Remember how the Russian side is dealing with this, because it's quite unique. It hasn't happened before. To be sure, we've not been quite this level of war before. Before Alaska, President Putin put on an international display of consensus building with all of Russia's strategic allies, with the sole exception of Mr. Pezeshkian, the Iranian president. Everyone else was telephoned. Everyone else. And the Indian side had two meetings, a telephone call with Prime Minister Modi and a face-to-face meeting at the Kremlin with the Modi's national security advisor, Ajit Doval. And since President Putin has called Prime Minister Modi again, and during this week, leading the Indian delegation in Moscow will be Mr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister. So at the top level, what Putin was able to show was he's coordinating and collectively deciding how to deal with the Americans on the part of China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the Central Asian countries, Belarus, and North Korea. Collective. Second, domestically, President Putin called in, roughly speaking, 21 officials, intelligence chiefs, the chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, before the meeting to say, okay, chaps, this is what we face. This is what I think. What do you think? They went round the room. Of course, we don't know exactly what was said. There were a certain number of people tell other people who tell me and tell everybody else in the media. And the consensus is there was consensus. That's very important. President Putin is demonstrating he's acting with consensus. That there are factional differences on how to handle the Americans. There is a consensus that there is nothing an American can say or do that is to be trusted, but that President Trump is the only opportunity available to Russia in the present situation and for the foreseeable 3 years to reach an accommodation that's in Russia's national interest, its military interest, and its business interest. Okay, so that's what happened on the way into Alaska, and on the way out, a similar process of consensus building. Now, there hasn't been time for a consensus discussion among officials of what happened a few hours ago in Washington. That's too soon. But what the Russian side can read is the leaked remilitarization plan that was in this morning's Financial Times, leaked directly by Zelensky. They can read what Chancellor Merz is proposing for remilitarization of Germany. And so from an intelligence point of view on the Russian side, from a military point of view on the Russian side, there's a new urgency. Aha, says the Russian side now to President Putin. You see, this is what they really aim to do now. They've accepted our line, no ceasefire without negotiations. Negotiations first, ceasefire second. But they've substituted a peace agreement that's a war agreement. And they insist that you show up to shake Zelensky's hand on the deal. What's to be done? That's where we are right now.
John, when it comes to the security guarantees that Ukrainians are asking for, what is the mindset of Russian comparing to what's going on in Washington and in Brussels, in Europe and Washington? What do they want? Are they gonna overlap, or is there significant differences between the parties involved? How do you see these parties coming together and making a common ground?
Well, I don't see the parties making a common ground at all. Impossible, strategically impossible. However, it's cleverly framed. Cleverly framed. Why do I say that? Because the Russian side has been long arguing since the December 17, 2021 presentation of security guarantees, two treaties, one for the United States, one for NATO. Security guarantees, mutual and reciprocal security guarantees for all of Europe and between Russia and the United States. Call that a plan for security guarantees too. From the Russian point of view, and it's common sense, there must be mutual and reciprocal security. You can't, security is indivisible, another phrase the Russian side often have used since December 17, 2021. In other words, a framework for European security that reduces risk of attack, that reduces apprehension of threat of attack on the European side and on the Russian side. If that's not mutual, it's not a security guarantee. It's one-sided. It's a preparation for redoing what we've just gone through. Okay. So to the extent that the Americans dismissed the December 17, 2021 treaties, they were never discussed by the Europeans. They were never allowed to be made public and discussed in the public media of the European states or the US states. They were dismissed summarily. That put us on the road to war, and the war began a few weeks later. Now, 3.5 almost months, years later, we're in a situation where security guarantees are suddenly surfaced by a combination of the European leaders and Zelensky, but they mean completely different things. Completely different. It's if you invest $50 billion worth of the latest US and NATO long-range drone technology, and you site it between Kiev and the Polish border with a range of hitting 5,000 kilometers eastwards, you are preparing a long-distance war against Russia, are you not? Is that a security guarantee? Not quite. We've had a variety of European proposals. Starmer and Macron spoken of a European reassurance force, always rejected, because the Russian position has been, look, you've been using the Ukrainian battlefield as a platform for de facto NATO war against us. It's a de facto NATO war against us. Let's not kid ourselves about what's happening. Second, as you've been doing that, to end this war, we're not going to allow your men to remain in place to police a demilitarized zone. Demilitarization means the withdrawal of long-range heavy weapons. The Ukrainians have come back and said, we want Patriot missile systems as part, and we're willing to buy them They're not willing to buy them. They will borrow the money from Europe and Canada. They will never repay the money. And the US will underwrite the loans and collect the cash. And the commissions will be carefully distributed. Okay? That's a scheme. In theory, Patriot missiles systems do not trouble the Russian side a great deal. They've been defeated wherever they've been in place. So if the US wants to place more Patriots around Kiev or Lvov, the Russians can defeat them. Let me just take a step back from a Russian point of view. This is not the first time that President Putin has had to deal with how corrupt an American presidency is. It's not the first time that it occurred to the Russian side to bribe the Americans for something that the Russian side wanted when things were a bit more cooperative. Between 2008 and 2009, General Motors was going broke in the United States. And the Russian and Germans, that's Putin and Chancellor Merkel at the time, came up with a plan involving some major German workers' unions and the Sberbank, the State National Bank of Russia, and a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, came up with a scheme of buying the Opel and Vauxhall works, but principally the Opel German car division from Germany, from GM, and developing a cooperative Russian-German car business based on Opel. Bribes were paid to the Clinton family. I told the story in The Man Who Knew Too Much About Russia. The bribes were identifiable. They were paid, and Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, left a record, which was subsequently revealed, of agreeing with Merkel, with the US ambassador to Germany, that the US would agree to the General Motors sale to Germany. And then she reversed herself, leaving Putin furious. And that's quite documented in the story I printed long time ago, 2008, 2009. That's quite a long time ago. From then on, President Putin knew that Hillary Clinton was a corrupt, cynical, untrustworthy individual, and nothing Americans would ever offer with bribes or without bribes would ever be honored. Now, it's a very serious problem. Bribe offer, bribe taking is pervasive in this world. This is nothing unusual. But for the Russians to conclude you can bribe an American but not rely on what they will do as a result began with Hillary Clinton, 2008, 2009. What's the difference when Stephen Witkoff is the bag man for the Trump family now? From a Russian point of view, this is not exactly to be spoken of in public. But as I've just told you, the history of bribing the Americans at the presidential level is a long and contentious and bitter one. So why should, at this point in time, President Putin, having demonstrated a level of sincerity and openness to President Trump, such that Trump thinks Putin wants to give him a deal, why should the Russian side believe the US side will deliver anything else but remilitarization, in which the Trump family pockets the commissions, and in which the outgoing Macron, Merz, Meloni, Starmer administrations and those individuals take very hefty retirements into the sunset?
John, when you mention remilitarization of Ukraine, you mean that Donald Trump sending weapons? I talk with military experts. They believe that it takes time for the United States to produce these arms, these
Yes,
weapons, to send them to Europe. But do you
yes,
feel that the Trump administration would send them to Ukraine or give the permission to Europeans to send them to Ukraine if something happens in terms of a settlement in Ukraine? Because that would be crucial for the Russian part. They don't want the Kiev and the government in Ukraine being able again to attack them. And they
correct,
want a neutralized Ukraine, a
correct.
Ukraine that is not that much powerful to make problems for them, or maybe invite NATO in.
Well, to invite NATO in is out of the question. It's not simply a question of no to the Ukraine ever forming, ever joining NATO. And this has been glossed into NATO Article 5 like
Yeah,
guarantees.
that's why
Uh,
the European are asking for this as
well,
something like Article 5, and
you,
as
you,
Maloney
you,
said.
well, you're making 2 points, and I think they're good ones, Nima. First of all of this takes time. And from Russian point of view, from American point of view, from European point of view, taking time is a benefit to all. Remember, one of the things that was agreed between President Putin, the Indian and Chinese leadership, was that Putin would do his level best to persuade Trump not to introduce secondary sanctions when threatened last week. Deadline's gone. President Trump has announced no secondary sanctions, though I might come back to this in 2, 3, or 4 weeks. So the idea is the false idea, remember, that Vitkov kept assuring Iran, so long as we keep talking on a peace agreement, there'll be no attack. Right, the position now is, as you said, all of these remilitarization schemes require time. Time to produce, time to buy, time to deliver, time to install. They also need a map, an agreement on where Russian territory ends, the de jure as well as de facto Russian territories, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, and Donetsk, where the beginning, where the end, where the westernmost border facing the Ukraine is, what then is demilitarized between that line and, let's say, Kiev. That we've described for months now as a demilitarized zone with various forms of verification, satellite verification, drone verification, inspection, infantry inspection, and so forth. Behind the demilitarized zone, whose shape, depth is still to be worked out and agreed, there is the rump Ukraine, and which has the security guarantees plus the reinvestment plus the resupply. Now, from a Russian point of view, and I'm certainly reflecting sources who will hear what they've been telling me, they need time to rearm also. They need time to restructure Russia's fighting forces, not only for this battlefield, but for the northern front from the Ukraine, north through Poland, up through the Finnish border, across the Arctic to the Far East, not to mention the southern front, which is now highly unstable with the American-Israeli attacks on Iran and the American-Israeli penetration of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Okay, so we've got all of these new problems, not to mention the American desire to mobilize Pakistan as a platform for continuing the war against Iran in the east of that country. Okay, all of these things require time. They also require goodwill. We're not talking here about goodwill. There is none. There can be none. Not with cynical, corrupt, multi-billion-dollar rearmament deal. Just to give everybody an idea what $50 billion of rearmament for Ukraine and $50 billion worth of investment means. The amount of scale, you will have heard, and we've talked about it before, that President Trump keeps repeating, I spent, the US spent, under Biden was spent for the last 3 years of war, $320 billion. And that the Europeans paid $100 billion. These numbers are false. They're false. A special inspector general of the Pentagon produces every 6 months or so a public report showing exactly how much money. And we've talked about it on your program in the past. The amount of money spent by the United States on and in the Ukraine is less than 80 billion over 3 years. So a reinvestment of 50 billion over roughly the same period of time is roughly the same as has already been spent. In that sense, we are going to war again, remilitarizing. But there's another 50 billion of investment in weapons manufacture. That's brand new. And it would be guarded from Russian air attack, of course, because it would be part of a so-called security guarantee peace agreement. Plus, there's the 50 billion euro rearmament plan of Germany, which is intimately connected not only with the Ukrainian battlefield, with the Polish battlefield, the Baltic states battlefields, and going up northwards through Finland. So, in fact, the amounts of money are now greater than have been spent since the special military operation began. Greater. So let's try to see the scale of what's called security guarantees. So with this scale of remilitarization, rearmament, going back to war, yes, you're right. It takes time. Time is what all sides want now. The problem is Russia's advancing. Russia has the military initiative. Russia can, by reopening the electric war campaign, destroy the capability of the Ukrainian forces to continue to fight. Why stop now and give up the operational, tactical, and ultimately strategic benefits on the battlefield? Why not fight to capitulation of the Ukrainian army and dictate a set of terms that will be more readily verifiable for the time ahead? Why tolerate remilitarization? Isn't that to sacrifice everything that's been fought for since February 2022? So yes, you're right, Nima. Time is what all sides want, including all Russian allies. Time is what the Americans want. The Pentagon strategists have been arguing for war sequencing. We need time to reorient our forces, say Elbridge Colby and the Pentagon operations and strategy planners, so as to reorient towards China. We will let the Europeans handle the war in Europe, and we will profit as best we can. That's not an abandonment of the US doctrine of hegemony. It's not an abandonment of make the empire great again. It's a sequencing of priorities based on time. So everybody would like time. How much time is necessary to kick the can down the road? And how much security do you gain over the period of time in which the can rolls away? Well, I think I've just said more or less enough to ask, and it's a Russian decision that has to be made in the next few days. After all, Merz and others have said Putin has to make up his mind to meet Zelensky in 2 weeks. The Russian side are hinting, actually, no, we're not going to be bound by time. We've got working groups at work to come up with terms for discussion if there's to be a meeting with Zelensky. So if and when the working groups have done their job and we've agreed on terms, then there can be a meeting with Zelensky. So in the very short time, and the very short term, the next 2 weeks, we've got to see what the Russian side says are the terms. And is there a clear Russian position on remilitarization? Because that's what Trump really means now.
John, what we've seen from the President Putin before the meeting and aftermath of the meeting, he called the BRICS countries and the Central Asia countries
Yes.
to inform them, to let them know what has happened. To what extent he's sharing the information, in your opinion, and what is he trying to tell them when it comes to Ukraine? Is something related to Ukraine, or he's trying to give them some sort of a general point of view of what's going on between the United States and Russia?
Well, with strategic partners like China and India, the conversation is highly detailed
Mm.
and it's based on the truth. I think that, especially since Prime Minister Modi has had his own direct experience of Trump, President Xi also, President Ramaphosa of South Africa, President Lula of Brazil, everyone's had direct contact and familiarity. They all know what Trump's capable of, what he's not capable of, and so forth. So I think that it would be reasonable to think and take at face value. President Putin briefs exactly what was said and asks and listens to what his counterparties, the strategic partners and allies, have to say. He answers their questions. I'm sorry, perhaps I misunderstood your question, but I think in that coalition, President Putin is capable of disclosing more truth than Trump is capable of disclosing to his European allies. For one thing, they're significantly more intelligent and capable of interacting in and asking questions and responding to answers than the American European coalition.
Yeah, it's
We've seen,
amazing.
for example, the two notorious bootlickers at the table yesterday were the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, the one who once called President Trump daddy, and Ursula von der Leyen, who's not elected by anybody, who was kicked out of Germany by Chancellor Merkel as one of the worst defense ministers that Germany had ever had, and sent off to Brussels, where she was harmless in German politics. Those two are simply are incapable of having a serious exchange of views, intelligence, strategic appreciation in their coalition. But between President Putin, Prime Minister Modi, President Xi, President Lula, and President Ramaphosa, it's different. And I don't mean to cast adverse reflections. The North Korean leadership, the Central Asian leadership, these are very important for Russia, and I don't believe there's anything less than the full truth disclosed in their conversations.
Yeah, it's amazing that you mentioned that the US European allies. When I look at this picture, I don't see any ally. And look at European leaders gathering around the Trump's desk and trying to communicate with him. What does that mean, John, when it comes to Europe and the policy of Europe? It seems that they're somehow desperate. They don't know what to do. They don't know. Even they're not, as you've mentioned, they're not satisfied with the situation in Ukraine, and they're somehow they don't have the power to go against the policy in Washington. And how do you see what's going on with Europe,
Well,
John?
it's a wonderful picture. It's very amusing if you look at who's in the front row. it's Meloni, von der Leyen, Merz,
And
Macron.
next to Meloni is Starmer. He's not in the picture, but
Well, I thought Starmer's in the back.
no,
I can't.
no, Starmer
Is on
here.
Maloney's
Yeah,
right.
in the back is Besant. The guy that you
Yes.
see in the back
Yes,
is
that's
Besant.
right.
You see in this picture, you see, next to
Yes,
Maloney,
yes.
Starmer here.
Yes, under the grinning visage of Ronald Reagan, above the map that was constructed for this group by the Institute of the Study of War in Washington, D.C., and given through Zelensky. Yes, it's a tutorial class of individuals with a political rating of less than 25% each. So they're all acting against public opinion in their own countries, taxpayer opinion. They're weaklings, they're political weaklings who have come up with a way of continuing the war that enriches them for their life, for what's left of their lifetimes. And let's be clear, from a Trump point of view, presidential politics are only 3 years, remain only 3 more years. And the one thing that President Trump keeps drumming away at, which is his peacemaking success, well, it has had no public opinion effect. His negative public approval is net negative, remains fixed, flat. It doesn't respond to his so-called foreign policy performance. In fact, his net negative overall measures is about -6%, but the net negative foreign policy approvals about -15%. So nothing he's doing that he thinks is peacemaking and winning is the slightest bit influential on public opinion among American voters. On the other hand, were he to be seen to have lost the Ukraine war in the way in which he says the Biden administration ran away from Kabul, he can't afford to lose a war, to be seen to be the physical defeat that he says Biden took in Kabul. So he, like they, are pitching at winning by spending taxpayer money for which they have almost no parliamentary approval and don't need it. And which, let's be frank about it, in which there's total propaganda support in their press. There isn't any. Our program, your podcast, Nima, is a unique beacon of truth-telling in the United States. There's nothing like it in Europe, I'm sorry to say. But there's what's our audience? What's the combined audience of the anti-war podcasting of the United States, North America, and Europe? Less than 1 million, I should think. Less than 1 million. So let's be frank. The propaganda war has been won by the West. That table of people face no criticism when they get home from their press. None at all. They know they control their press. They know that they control their parliaments, that they can rule without their parliaments, as Macron does effectively. To them, unpopularity hasn't imposed a political cost because there's no media cost and there's no election cost. Not yet. And Merz's approach to his losing position in Germany is repression. is to attack the AfD, which gets steadily stronger as Merz gets weaker. So the propaganda war's been lost, and to answer your question, they are weak, but they are not defeated when they go home. There isn't anybody they have to wave their piece of paper at, as Chamberlain waved his piece of paper after meeting with Hitler in Munich. Chamberlain had a far more difficult job of convincing British public opinion and parliamentary opinion at the time that he had made an effective deal with Hitler. Let's leave aside that he didn't, but he bought time. There's nothing comparable now in our media, in our Western media, to this podcast. Nothing comparable. Therefore, those people aren't at political risk. So they go down slowly on domestic issues, and they conceal the cost of the Ukraine war.
John, before wrapping up this session, we had Donald Trump before being elected in the United States talking about how he cares about the United States, make America great again, and
Yes.
talking all about the United States. And you see Donald Trump during the last 6 months. And do you feel that Donald Trump somehow has changed his mindset toward his strategy? Because before coming to power, it was all about the United States. But it seems to me it's the same plan. As time goes by, those ideas are fading away, that somehow he's looking after the American hegemony. You've mentioned Azerbaijan
Yes.
and Armenia. You've mentioned the situation with Europe. I would argue, he said, it was just 2 weeks ago, he was bragging about sending weapons. Europe is buying the weapons to continue the conflict in Ukraine, and they're
Yes.
paying him for that.
Yes.
It's not about America making America. It's all about making the hegemony, American hegemony, great again. Do you think that the plan would be in the next 3 years that he's going to be in power in Washington, in the United
Yes.
States, that would be the main agenda?
Well, it's one of the main public policy or foreign policy items on his agenda. Yes. First, don't lose. Always seem to be a winner. Second, keep beating a propaganda drum on how much money you're pulling into the United States. I mean, I'm, as I said when we began, we need to control our gag reflex. If the more you look at Trump's language, the more you look at the disabilities of somebody who simply fabricates, and who in fact can't read, and who sees pictures, and who recites slogans. This is not a mind. This is something less than a mind applied to making money, making power, making votes, and doing that as effectively and as quickly as he can with a circle of people around him. That's how I see it. It's a fundamental fallacy from a presidential vote counting point of view to imagine that you can translate this kind of what Trump calls winning wars or peacemaking into votes. The polls keep showing that he's wrong about that. So he can't keep making that mistake. That's a mistake that will be tested at the midterm elections next year. But the Democratic Party's no serious opposition at presidential level, not yet. Next year, at the midterms, they don't need a national leader. They need to win at the local level, which is what they'll do. And what they'll do is different on the Jewish issue, the genocide issue, from the Ukraine war issue. The Ukraine war issue was not a significant political vote getter or vote loser during the previous presidential election or the one before it. So that Trump keeps repeating an election tactical mistake, he'll correct in time. But it doesn't matter, in my view. It doesn't matter what he says. He's getting richer and more powerful personally, as his wife just did with that children letter, as his sons are doing. The scale of enrichment of the family that the Trumps are engaged in dwarfs anything that Hunter Biden and his father did in the Ukraine. Those two probably accumulated the Burisma scandal that I reported on years and years ago, in which Hunter Biden was involved, somewhere between $5 and $20 million. That's small change to Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Melania Trump. Small change. You got to add a digit or two, another zero. The level of family enrichment is a magnitude greater. But the press, not there. Not there. I mean, I don't take the New York Times seriously. Nobody should. We don't even need to criticize the New York Times anymore. The Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the US media are incapable now. And they never did an investigative job properly. They discredited themselves on Russiagate. So we don't need to rehash that. The podcast audience knows what we're talking about. I think we shouldn't exaggerate that President Trump has a mind. What we should focus on is the calculations behind the slogans. And I think we've shown today that what they've got coming next is a scale of self-enrichment, the likes of which the United States hasn't seen before.
Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima. See you next week.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.